Okay, we'll begin our second work session this morning on the Lower Columbian Salmon and Steelhead Recovery Update. We so much have been looking forward to this. I'm hopeful that all the counselors want to hear this, but mostly I wish the audience was packed. I mean, communicating with the public is one of our hardest challenges, and this is so important. The state, the nation is spending so much money and so concerned about recovery efforts that I would think the room would be filled, but thank you so much for coming in person to present to us. Why don't you go ahead and give us the update?
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Council members, appreciate the opportunity to be here today. For the record, my name is Steve Manlow. I'm the Executive Director of the Lower Columbia Fish Recovery Board, and with me I have Denise Smee, and she is our Program Manager. So today I wanted to provide an overview of how we are doing with salmon and steelhead recovery in the Lower Columbia, and this is based on a recent update we conducted looking at how viable our populations are across the region. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start by kind of covering the architecture of salmon recovery in the state of Washington. What you see here kind of reflects how we are organized to approach salmon recovery in this state. The Lower Columbia Fish Recovery Board was created back in 1998 under state statute RCW 7785, and we wear multiple hats. First and foremost, we are a regional recovery organization. So if you look at the color coding on the map, you'll see there's about 8 regional recovery organizations in the state. And our role as a recovery organization is to facilitate development, local development of salmon and steelhead recovery plans, and then to kind of oversee and facilitate implementation of those plans over the long term. We are also one of the state's 25 lead entities, so the smaller polygons you see on the map there represent our lead entity boundaries. And what a lead entity is basically an organization that helps implement the state's Salmon Recovery Funding Board program. So vetting projects, working with our sponsor organizations to identify what needs to be done on the ground, ranking those projects, and then recommending those to the state for funding. So we spend a lot of time working on those lead entity activities. We work under the umbrella of the Recreation Conservation Office. That's a state agency, largely an agency that manages funding programs. They're our fiduciary, and they help manage the statewide elements of what we do as a regional organization and the lead entity. We also work closely with the Governor's Salmon Recovery Office. They were also created in state statute. They're now housed within the Recreation Conservation Office, and they are there to basically ensure that we are approaching recovery from a statewide perspective. They maintain a statewide strategy. They work with the regions, tribes, local governments, to make sure that we're approaching things in a consistent and effective manner across the state. And then there's the Salmon Recovery Funding Board that I mentioned. They are the entity that annually allocates funding to different projects across the state and to the Lower Columbia down in our region here. I won't speak to the last bullet. That might be a separate presentation down the road. So next slide, please. So how we are organized was really set out in that state statute. Our board consists of 15 members, and we have members from each of the Southwest Washington counties, county commissioners and councilors. Chair Medvedji was formerly on our board, and the current Clark County seat is Councilor Marshall. We have a citizens rep from each county. a Washington State legislative representative, Cowlitz Indian tribe, a city's rep, environmental representatives, as well as property interest and hydroelectric representatives, because we have two major hydroelectric facilities in our region as well. We also manage a technical advisory committee, and what you see here is the current representation of that group, and this is a group of technical experts that works with staff and our board to help rank and review projects, provide advice to the board on recovery issues, and they play a major role in ensuring that we come up with very strategic and thoughtful recovery projects in the region. Next slide, please. So our plan in the Lower Columbia was the first prepared in the state and the first adopted by both the state and federal government. And what you see here on the left, you see Bill Dygert. He's recently passed away, fantastic conservationist. He was our original chair. In the middle, you see former director of Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Jeff Cannings, and then on the right, former Governor Gary Locke, signing off on our plan. And this was in 2004. The plan was then updated in 2010 after Coho were listed, and in 2013, it was rolled up with Oregon's plan, as well as NOAA's plan for the estuary into what we call the regional or domain plan. So it has three pieces: the Washington side, the Oregon side, and kind of the main stem. Fish don't recognize political boundaries, so you need to have plans that are talking with each other, and that's how we approached it in the Lower Columbia. Next slide, please. So this is kind of why we're here, and it's to return salmon and steelhead and bull trout in the Lower Columbia to healthy and harvestable levels. This is our vision statement. It acknowledges the fact that we need to be sustaining sport, commercial, tribal fisheries on the path to recovery, and to make sure those populations can sustain that harvest in the over time. And also, we need to make sure that hatchery operations, fishery practices, hydro practices align with recovery needs. So it's not just about habitat, but our recovery plan truly addresses all the different factors that address salmon and steelhead recovery, and that's really reflected in our vision statement out of the plan. Next slide, please. So the current status of our fish stocks is the result of a lot of impacts across a lot of different factors that date back over 100 years. The plan is built on the concept that to support viability improvements, and by viability, what we're talking about is the ability of fish to sustain themselves over time and not blink out. You really need to address multiple factors, and those factors vary depending on the species you're talking about, and within the species, on within populations as well. So there's no silver bullet when it comes to recovery. You often see out there, folks will point to certain factors and, hey, that's what we need to fix, and we're going to get there with recovery. The reality is, for each different stock and species, it's a variety of impacts that we need to be thinking about and addressing on the path to recovery. There is no silver bullet when it comes to salmon and steelhead recovery. Next slide, please. So we recently completed what we call a viability update in partnership with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And this was basically a look at how are we doing since ESA listings with recovery relative to the goals that were set. And we're now trying to get the word out on what we're finding. And it's going to really help shape where we go in the future with salmon and steelhead recovery. Next slide, please. So if we start at the region-wide level, these are some conclusions that really apply to all of our species across the whole region. First and foremost, what we found is that the long-term declining trends appear to have been arrested for the review period. So we're not seeing further declines in the stocks. The viability of about 35% of our 72 populations is greater now than at the time of listing, and that is huge. We don't see that in a lot of different parts of the state, but we are seeing some really good progress when you look at the population scale improvements that we're seeing. About 20% of our populations are already at high or higher viability, meaning that if you look out 100 years, there's a 95% chance that they're going to be there, right? So some of the populations are already doing quite well relative to our targets. We've seen species level improvements for two-leaf false chinook or coho, chum, and both winter and summer steelhead. We still struggle with spring chinook. Our spring chinook populations are focused in the Cowlitz and the Lewis subbasins. So the effort there is really centered on making sure the hydro company reintroduction programs are successful. That's going to be foundational to moving the dial on spring chinook. We're making progress, but it's going to be slow progress as we dial in those reintroduction programs. And then lastly, about 64% of the populations are still at low or very low viability, so we're not at a point of being able to, petition for any delisting for a species yet, although a couple are very promising candidates, namely steelhead and coho. We're seeing some good progress, so in the next 5 years or so, we want to really focus on what would it take to get those species delisted. Next slide. So now let's focus on how we're doing in Clark County. What you see here are the subbasins that overlap with Clark County. We have 17 major subbasins in the lower Columbia region. They extend from the mouth of the Little White Salmon River down to the ocean in the main stem Columbia. Next slide, please. And this shows the number of ESA-listed salmon and steelhead populations in each of those watersheds. So what you see here, the North Fork Lewis has 7 populations. The East Fork has 5, Washougal 5, Salmon Creek 4, and then the lower gorge tributaries, which are kind of the smaller tributaries that drain directly to the Columbia River out in East County. There are 4 ESA-listed populations there as well. Next slide, please. This shows the number of primary populations. So we designate different populations based on their importance to recovery. The primary populations are the ones that we need to get up to high or higher viability to meet our region-wide goals. So these are the most important populations that we focus on in our habitat work and our other work when it comes to recovery. And what you'll see here, both the North Fork and East Fork have a high number of primary populations. So if you step back from a region-wide perspective, these are critically important watersheds for recovery. The East Fork in particular is the only watershed in the lower Columbia that has 5 populations, 5 primary populations. So we have placed a tremendous amount of effort into recovery into the East Fork, and I know that's an important watershed for the county as well. Next slide, please. And this slide shows the number of populations that are already meeting their viability targets in each of those watersheds. We have one in the North Fork Lewis River. That's what we call our fall bright Chinook. They're healthy and harvestable. They're meeting their delisting targets. There's a 44% harvest rate on those stocks, and it's not affecting their viability. Doing quite well. We have 2 in the East Fork, and I'll kind of get into the details on those later. One in Salmon Creek, that's the Salmon Creek coho population, which has actually performed quite well since ESA listing. 2 in the Washougal, and then 1 in the lower gorge tributaries. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of information here, but devil's in the detail, and we'll start with the bottom line where it says average viability baseline. This is where we were at ESA listing. And VL means very low, very high is VH, low, medium, high viability. And where you see, for example, a hash with a VL/M, like you see for Lower Gorge, that means at the time of listing we're very low. Where we are today is a medium. So this will kind of give you a flavor of how well the different populations in each watershed are performing today. So for fall Chinook, we've seen improvements in the Lower Gorge and the North Fork Lewis River. I already mentioned the fall brights in the Lewis River. We're at very high viability at listing and are still there today. We're not making much headway on spring Chinook. They're still at very low. But again, it's all about the hydro program and getting reintroduction going in that system. Coho are actually performing quite well in the region, a couple of populations. We started off at very low viability. You look at the average there for the region as a whole is low, but you look at the individual populations in each of the watersheds, and we have the East Fork Lewis has moved up from very low to low, Salmon Creek from very low to high. Again, that was a pleasant surprise to see how well they're performing. And then the Lower Gorge from very low up to moderate viability. The chum populations in the county are doing quite well. They're both at very high viability today. And then both winter and summer steelhead, we see some success stories there as well, and are performing as well as the species across the region as a whole, and in some cases better. For example, the East Fork Lewis River, we're seeing high viability for winter steelhead, very high viability for summer steelhead. So seeing some really good progress in the county when it comes to steelhead viability. Any questions on that before I move on? It's kind of a complicated graphic.
Councilor Marshall,
I have a
did you
question.
Questions right away?
Yes,
Okay,
I
we'll
was
defer
wondering,
to Karen Bowerman. Go ahead.
what is the definition of very low or very high viability? What does that
Very
represent?
Yeah, so very high viability would mean that there's a greater than 95% chance that that population is going to sustain itself for 100 years. Very low viability is just the opposite. It means based on current performance, there's about a 95% chance or only 5% chance that they will persist over that time period. So two ends of the spectrum there.
Does that conclude your questions, Karen?
Yes, and I'm assuming that the high and the low is some variation between 95 and 5, but we get the idea.
Yes, yep. It's a gradation, yes.
Okay, Councilor Marshall.
Yes, thank you. I know you've been at this for a very long time, Steve, so I appreciate all of your involvement with this. And, you know, serving on the board and seeing some of the data that's been compiled, I felt it was really important for the public and for the council to get a better understanding, because it is slow going, but where progress is being made, that's a good news story. But I do have a question related to the spring Chinook, and if you could elaborate on the reintroduction of the for the hydro-blocked habitat. What's the strategy there? What does that look like?
Yeah, the strategy there for the Lewis River, and that's our primary spring Chinook population, because we have 3 dams, Merwin, Yale, and Swift, we need to get fish to all available habitat that drains to each one of those reservoirs. So the strategy is to collect the fish at the base of Merwin Dam, and there's an existing trap there now that Pacificor manages. Those fish are then trucked to the upper watershed and released. And then the juveniles, after rearing, come back down into Swift Reservoir, and they're collected in a juvenile collector, and again, trucked down to the bottom of the watershed, released, they head out to the ocean and come back. The current process involves additional collection facilities in Lake Merwin, in Yale, and in Swift, so we can get full distribution throughout the entire watershed and into the tributaries that drain to those reservoirs. So the current work is really about designing those facilities, which is underway. I think they're at about 60% design, constructing them, and then implementing them. So it's a long-term prospect, but Spring Chinook depend almost entirely on making that successful. So we spend a lot of time working with the hydro companies on their design efforts and whatnot tied with that. But it's all about getting fish into the system, out to the ocean, and back, and making full use of those tributaries.
Thank you.
Yep.
So I just want to add to that because the chair did a good presentation a couple of years ago on their efforts. And so there's a lot of company contribution in this process. I mean, very costly, time-consuming. But it's, you know, dams are a problem. And this process is somewhat primitive. I mean, it really stresses the fish during collection, transport, and then release. And there's too much of an attrition rate. I mean, it's not a good process. I mean, so looking forward to improvement on it as long as those dams remain, and we expect them to remain. So all the effort that goes into those processes and how the column of water is collected with fish in it and then moved without stressing the fish and having less of an attrition rate would be a significant way forward for your efforts.
Yes, yep, absolutely, Chairman Medvigi. And there's a lot of work to dial in those systems like the juvenile collection. They've been working on adjustments to the collector. The goal is to collect 95% of the fish that come down and, you know, start to enter the collector. And I don't have the exact numbers, but, you know, we're not there yet. We're probably more around, you know, 40 to 60%, depending on the species. But it's improving, and there's adaptive management that's going on. It's really complex. The hydro companies are looking across the Northwest at what has and has not been working in other facilities and kind of using that as they design the current facilities that they're working on. So, yeah.
Further comments or questions? Okay, please.
Okay. Next slide, please. And again, I just wanted to emphasize with this slide, this is really busy, but this is based on some work that NOAA Fisheries did in a Columbia Basin-wide effort recently, looking at the balance of impacts across each of the species. So each piece of the pie that you see here represents what we call one of the H's, like habitat or hatchery impacts or harvest impacts. But the take-home message is, depending on the species, it's really a mix of things that's affecting the viability of these populations. The big blue pieces of the pie, that's habitat, and that's pretty universal. That's a pretty big chunk of impacts, you know, and where we put a lot of time in terms of working with, you know, local jurisdictions on improving habitat for fish. So the recovery plan, when it comes to county work as well, really emphasizes those things that are addressing habitat. So I wanted to highlight just a few things that we as a board would see as priorities for the county going forward. So next slide, please. We wanted to first touch on the county conservation programs, especially the Legacy Land Program. This graphic shows Clark County ownership in the East Fork Lewis River watershed. And as I noted earlier, that is an absolutely critical watershed when it comes to region-wide recovery, because we have 5 primary populations in there. I think there's been about 4,000 acres secured or protected in that basin, and we would strongly support further work in the East Fork. I know recently the county picked up the old Ridgefield Pits project, and what it does is it not only protects the values that are there now for fish, but it opens the door for active restoration. So we would strongly support the county's ongoing conservation work, especially in the East Fork Lewis River watershed. It's just, critically important from a regional perspective. Next slide. One of the more difficult things to get your arms around is how do we consider salmon and steelhead recovery in broader planning processes, in the comprehensive planning processes. Over the long term, whether or not we recover fish, it's not going to be driven as much by the active restoration work that's being done out on the ground, as much as making sure that the watershed processes stay intact, and that as we continue to grow as a community and we need space as people to grow, we need to be thinking about where we put those people relative to high priority areas for salmon and steelhead. So protecting forest lands, making sure we have working forest lands, ag lands, open space is critically important, and that's stuff that needs to be considered up front in the planning process, not as an afterthought after something is already rezoned and an individual project comes in. So thinking proactively about where we're putting people and our ability to maintain watershed processes is really important, and we're always available to, talk with the county staff as they embark on county planning efforts to identify those critical watersheds. And again, East Fork, North Fork, Cedar Creek are three in particular that are really important to think about when it comes to the broader planning programs. Next slide, please. At the same time, protecting critical areas wherever they occur is vitally important, and a lot of the actions in the recovery plan speak to counties and cities protecting wetlands, riparian corridors, aquifer recharge areas, those sorts of things where they do occur. And so always, ensuring that those protective standards are adequate, and we really appreciate the work that Clark County has done in the last few years, improving protections under the Critical Areas Ordinance, under the Shoreline Management Master Program. Wider riparian buffers, for example, are all critical things that need to be done to make sure that we're holding on to these fish populations and not going backwards. And we've seen Clark County as a leader in terms of stepping up and updating those programs. We really appreciate that. And there again, we stand ready to kind of help as the county contemplates, different regulatory programs and those things.
Can we pause, because I do have a question on this area, and it's very timely. It's happening right now.
Yep.
And I posed the question to community development regarding inputs into our environmental element of our comprehensive plan, and that goes to, we have a lot of state forests, we have federal forests, and my question basically goes to this. The watershed goes through it. It may have headwaters of those watersheds in it. And when a state agency or a federal agency, for that matter, manages separately those jurisdictional forests and may plan to cut, I know we've had some communication with DNR in the past and great cooperation in protecting these forests. In that Molten Falls area cut, we did a transfer of land to preserve that cut, in part because of the potential runoff and negative impacts on the East Fork. So I'm wondering what kind of collaboration is happening through your agency, your board, with the forestry management, both at the federal and state level, to make sure that they're not clear-cutting a forest that's going to impact one of our watersheds, it's going to really impact our recovery efforts?
Yes, excellent question. And we are coordinating in a similar manner with the state agencies and federal agencies as we are with the counties and cities. When you look at the recovery plan, it puts a lot of weight on the forest and fish rules out there, implementing those, adaptively managing those based on what we're learning. So one of the things we do as an organization is we work via the Governor's Salmon Recovery Office because they are at the table in many of those forums. Right now, we're having discussions, by we, I mean all the recovery regions, with the Governor's Salmon Recovery Office in looking at the statewide budget submittals for 2025 and 2027. And we're providing recommendations on priorities and where we see a need to improve protections, or if they're proposing something that will move recovery forward, supporting that effort in the legislative process. So we kind of work the avenues where we can. And you're absolutely right. You look at something like a watershed like the East Fork, the whole middle part of the watershed is industrial forest land, either state or private. And the upper part of the watershed is managed by the U.S. Forest Service. And in general, you know, their management has been quite protective. We're trying to open up lines of communication with Department of Natural Resources on those middle lands in the watershed to better understand when they harvest, where they harvest, how much, and how we can kind of help inform that process with recovery priorities. So we engage where we can. You know, we're not a regulator, but we're trying to be at the table in these forums to help work with folks on improving management, you know.
So to that end, and then we'll move on, but are you, in the news is the Dabbler project, you know, about to come to auction through DNR. Are you looking at that at all? Does that impact?
Which project was that?
DABBLER.
I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not speaking clearly enough into the microphone.
Yeah.
DNR is about, I think they just ended the comment period for the cut. And there hasn't been a whole lot of discussion on the watershed particular.
Okay.
Just general discussion about ecosystems, spotted owls, things like that, but not fish recovery. And I don't know the specifics of what streams or water-bearing, fish-bearing impacts there may or may not be. But I was just wondering if you knew about and were engaged in that discussion.
That one, I am not familiar with that. We do have a work session scheduled with the DNR regional managers here in a couple of weeks. I'll now put it on my list of topics to ask about. So, yeah.
Just to follow up, I was curious about that and your involvement with any of the DNR land and proposed cuts. So I can forward you the information that we've received. A great number of emails on this particular one, and I know one of the organizations is organizing a tour actually to go up, and I'll pass that information along as well.
Thank you. Yeah, we'd be happy to look at it and engage from a regional recovery organization perspective. Yes.
Your inbox may fill up quickly.
That's okay. Yeah. Okay. Next slide, please. And I also wanted to emphasize one of the biggest gaps when it comes to recovery work, it's monitoring, it's understanding what's happening on the landscape, how effective programs are at protecting the habitat baseline and improving habitat conditions out there. We did a little pilot project back in 2018 and 19, again, looking at the East Fork Lewis River and asking those questions. How are we doing at effectively protecting those watershed processes? And it's hard to come up with answers. So we're in the mode now of trying to work with folks, you know, counties, cities, agencies, on better monitoring, you know, of habitat conditions so we can see, we know how the fish are responding, you know, we have the programs in place to do that, but what we don't have are the programs in place to look at trends and status of habitat conditions over time. So we just wanted to highlight this as a focal area going forward, and whatever opportunities there are to work with your staff as they're, you know, looking at the different programs that they manage, maybe building in elements to, you know, help monitor habitat conditions over time. So it's a gap that is statewide, I would say, right now. And then lastly, fish passage. We're in the process right now of conducting, it's actually being led by the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership, but we're at the table with them, a region-wide barrier inventory. So looking at all the bridges and culverts and other barriers to fish passage across the entire region, getting those into the GIS system, making that information available, and then doing some prioritization work on the most important barriers to be looking at when it comes to, you know, getting fish into currently blocked habitat. So we hope to have this wrapped up, I think, by spring of 2025, and at that point, we'll be reaching out to the different counties and cities to talk about what we've learned, what are the priority barriers that need correction, and then working with folks on finding funding for those barriers to help correct them. So just wanted to highlight that this is something I think that's going to be very, very useful for counties and cities in particular in their roads programs to understand where the barriers are and what the priorities are for correcting those. So those are kind of the areas of focus that we wanted to just bring to your attention today. Next slide. And I think that's the end of my formal presentation, but happy to answer any questions that you have.
I just have one more question because it popped. You know, we're giving quite a bit of attention to our watersheds as far as how they're ending up in our lakes, and especially with stormwater runoff, nutrient loading, phosphate filters, in all of our systems. We're giving that much more attention. I didn't really ever make the connection between fish recovery of any kind and nutrient loading within our watershed as we look to domestic users, you know, all the residences out there, not overusing fertilizers, to our farmers, you know, appropriately managing their loading into our watershed. What impact, if any, is phosphate or nitrogen or typical nutrient loading into our watershed? How does it impact salmon recovery, steelhead recovery, if at all?
Yeah, the actual nutrient issues really, when it comes to salmon and steelhead survival, it's a food chain thing, right? Where if you really mess up the nutrient cycle, end up with algae growth, you're disrupting the food chain at its most fundamental level. So that's really kind of that linkage. And if you couple that with things like temperature problems, that's a direct mortality factor for our steelhead. And, you know, with some of the changes we've seen in temperature over the last 50 years in our watersheds, some of the projected trends, you start coupling nutrient problems with high temperatures, and it's going to be a challenge for a lot of these populations, but it's really those food chain impacts that are the primary concern. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Hopefully we'll all join together in educating the public on their contribution to those issues. Yeah. Other comments or questions?
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead, Karen Bowerman.
You know, my question is going to reflect the fact that I am a preparer of fish and not a fisher person. So I need help in understanding steelhead. My understanding is that they may either migrate to the ocean or they may just stay in fresh water. And so I don't understand their behavior and why there is that kind of a difference. I don't understand how fish recovery necessarily affects them when they're in one of those populations or the other. Could you educate me, please, on those steelhead?
Yes, excellent question. I'll first caveat, I'm not a fish biologist, but what I can say, steelhead do have the most diversity of all the salmon species when it comes to their life cycle, and you just hit on one of those differences between other species in steelhead. You'll find some rainbow trout, for example, in a headwater tributary, may end up heading out to the ocean, right, and becoming anadromous. In some cases, when habitat has been opened up, that historically was blocked, you might see a change in life history pattern where now all of a sudden they'll head out to the ocean and kind of transition to that anadromy cycle. Steelhead can also spawn multiple times, unlike some of the other species, right? So they can move up into a system, spawn, and then head back out to the ocean and spawn again, whereas, chump, chinook, coho, once they come back and spawn, they die, and that's it. So, yeah, steelhead life cycles are very complex and diverse compared to the other species. I could recommend a couple of different articles that kind of talk about that if I could follow up with that if that would be helpful.
I would be interested in that. And I've heard that some people even classify them as trout rather than as salmon. And I don't understand that either. So I'd be interested in learning more.
Okay. He probably has some good recipes for you, too.
Yes, I have quite a few
I have
myself.
the recipes.
Councilor Marshall?
Great, thank you. I was interested in the no net loss monitoring, and I've been curious about this for a number of years because it seemed to me that the mitigation plan, there's an assumption with the mitigation plan that there's no net loss, but often there's not really monitoring to see how well that mitigation has occurred. So are your efforts going to improve that?
Well, we, as part of our effort as regions working through the governor's office, have really been emphasizing the need for more robust monitoring. So we're kind of working that through the legislative side. But you're absolutely right. There's, and I call myself a recovering regulator. I used to, work for the Corps of Engineers. I worked for counties. I worked for State Fish and Wildlife in a regulatory role. And we, monitored only a very small percentage of those mitigation plans to know whether or not they're effective. The kind of monitoring that we see is really important. It's not so much the project by project scale, but it's looking at the landscape, looking at the stream, looking at the riparian corridors, sediment levels, and things like that to understand how the cumulative effect, right, of what we're doing on the landscape is affecting fish habitat over time. Then you can hone in on, if you got a grip on are conditions improving or degrading, you can start to hone in on the causal mechanisms, right? But I could not tell you, for example, right now, in a particular reach of the East Fork Lewis River, are conditions improving or declining? The fish are telling us some things that are good, right? But that landscape scale monitoring, looking at watershed processes is really the biggest gap, I would say. And there's some efforts to get at that. The state's no net loss proviso that they're working on has a flavor of better monitoring for no net loss, but it's a big gap. Yeah.
I think that cumulative impact often isn't fully assessed because decisions get made project by project, so that's a struggle as well. And then as I know that I'm thinking of climate change and what the future may look like, and and when I look at Clark County and our overall what we provide to the entire system, I look at the cold water inputs and I think of the Lewis River and the Washougal. Are there other streams, or could you talk about how important that is, those cold water refuges that are formed?
Yes, especially in light of climate change, kind of focusing on those cold water refuge systems, the Lewis River, the Cowlitz River, Kalama, up north. There's some down in the gorge. From kind of a system standpoint, acknowledging that those are going to be strongholds and resistant to climate change, and kind of managing around that is going to be really important. The other piece would be within river systems, and I'll use the East Fork Lewis River for an example. The Estuary Partnership did some analysis on finding cold water inputs along the whole river corridor. So understanding where you, for example, have groundwater inputs, or surface water spring type inputs that can serve as refuge areas, even though the system as a whole might be getting warmer. Protecting those cold water input areas and doing restoration and protection work around those is critically important. The Estuary Partnership in particular has been kind of a leader in trying to tease out those priorities in the future. So we'll be using that information and working with folks on protection and restoration programs.
Great, thanks for that. And I would say, even though we don't have the room packed with people, we can share a link, and this will be available for folks to share this information.
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
So, Sue kind of sparked one other question for me. The years that I was on your board, and one of the presentations as far as, okay, the dial's moving, the dial's not moving, the dial's got a long way to go. It's so hard to measure some of the successes and things that aren't working. But one of the presentations that, we received several of them, involves our predators.
Yeah.
The Marine Mammal Protection Act and all the work that was done in Congress on making the availability of being able to take out some of those California seals and sea lions that really comprise an infestation in some portions of the Columbia River. Unhealthy populations, and you get to a dam, you get to a waterfall. Where they were eliminated, at least in part, there was a direct correlation to fish recovery.
Yes.
Because, some of these mammals are 1,000 pounds. Their biomass, and they are voracious. They are eating a ton of our fish every day. Is there any progress at all on moving the dial? I know there's a huge constituency on protecting those cute California seals and sea lions, but of all the programs I saw and all the things that we measured, that was the most obvious. This is working.
Yeah. Predation is one of those things where you turn the dial, immediate response, right? And the same with harvest, for example, compared to habitat, where you turn the dial and it might be 3 fish life cycles down the road when you see the benefit. But in terms of progress, yes, with the changes to the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the ability to do lethal take in the Columbia River, harvest, and actually, harvest those animals, predation rates have dropped, right? And a good example would be Willamette, the Willamette River steelhead at Willamette Falls were getting hit pretty hard. There were efforts to reduce the pinniped predation there, and it's really improved the viability of that steelhead population. And we're seeing benefits in the main stem Columbia below Bonneville Dam with the changes that have occurred. I think I might have a slide somewhere nested in there that you might be able to look at that kind of shows where we were and where we are today with predation rates, but progress is being made. I will say the lower Columbia stocks are not as impacted as much by pinniped predation as some of the mid and upper Columbia stocks, where there was a time period, for example, with upper Columbia spring Chinook, they were getting impacted at about a 40% rate, right? Those fish are stacking up at Bonneville Dam and being hit. Yes, and here you can see, these are fishery impacts here. Might be 2 slides further, I think. Here we go. Yeah, this is some recent data from 2023, and it was just kind of a snapshot showing observed predation at Bonneville Dam. And you can see there, for example, steelhead, for every 100 fish that were making it over the dam, 145 were being preyed upon below the dam, right? So 145% rate. And then much lower for some of the other species during this study. But our stocks in the lower Columbia are not nearly as impacted as those that kind of keg up at Bonneville Dam and those pinch points in the system. But progress is being made, and yeah, the congressional authorization to kind of loosen up restrictions has really been beneficial. Yeah.
Super. Thanks for that update. Any last questions or comments? Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We need to get the word out on all the great work and successes you are having, and the work that still remains, and how every individual can participate in adding, doing their little bit. Don't use too much phosphate on your lawn.
There we go.
But
thank you.
So thank you so much for taking the time and coming in and speaking to us today. I think that is our last work session this morning. So we will adjourn and resume for council time at 1 p.m. Great seeing you both.
All right. Thank you. You too.